One of the most serious and threatening uprisings that plagued Henry VIII during his reign was the Pilgrimage of Grace. Beginning in Yorkshire in October 1536, it quickly spread to other parts of northern England and was led by many, including the lawyer Robert Aske. The Pilgrimage of Grace was a protest against Henry VIII's break with the Roman Catholic Church and the dissolution of the monasteries. The protest also maintained the stance against the policies of the King's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, and many other policies that Henry VIII had implemented. Following the rebellion's suppression, Robert Aske would meet his end in a horrific and brutal execution in York. Join us today as we look at the brutal execution of Robert Aske, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Robert Aske was born into a well-connected family. His mother, Elizabeth Clifford, was the daughter of John Clifford, a baron, and he was also related to Henry Clifford, the 2nd Earl of Cumberland. Henry VIII's third wife and queen, Jane Seymour, was also a distant relative, being his third cousin. In 1527, he went to work for Henry Percy, the 6th Earl of Northumberland. However, later that year, he was admitted to Gray's Inn, one of the 4 ancient inns of the court in London. These were sometimes considered to be the third university of England at the time, as men who attended these inns were not only trained in law, but were also taught history as well. Here Robert would learn all about the legalities and would study charters such as the Magna Carta. After his studies, he returned to Yorkshire and worked as a lawyer. When a rebellion broke out in York against Henry VIII, Aske was returning to Yorkshire from London, and he quickly became caught up in the action against the king. He was captured by a group of rebels after an uprising began in the market town of Louth in Lincolnshire about the decision to close the local monasteries. The rebels captured the local offices and demanded the arrest of leading church figures and deemed them to be heretics. This included powerful Bishop Hugh Latimer and also Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. They then wrote to the king, saying that they were suffering from extreme poverty. However, soon the whole county of Lincolnshire would be rebelling against Henry VIII. Robert Aske agreed to use his talents as a lawyer to help the rebels' cause and wrote letters of complaint for them, saying that their disputes were not specifically with the king or the nobility, but instead with the government of their country, including especially Thomas Cromwell. Aske now quickly rose to prominence within the rebels' ranks. He returned home to Yorkshire and began to persuade people from his own county to join and support the rebellion. This quickly became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. The people of Yorkshire were incredibly unhappy as well, not only just because of the attacks on religion, but there were also poor harvests that plagued the north, unpopular taxes, and many local issues as well. Aske quickly got to work on mobilizing the unhappy citizens, and within a few days, thousands of men had risen up in the East Riding and were marching towards York. Robert called on the men to take an oath to join the Pilgrimage of Grace for the Commonwealth and for maintaining God's faith and the Church's preservation of the King's person and issue. On the 11th of October 1536, Aske and his army arrived at Jervaux Abbey. The abbot, Adam Sedbar, stated how the rebels wanted him to take an oath to support the Pilgrimage of Grace. Sedbar refused to take the oath, but was threatened with execution, and he joined the rebellion. This shows you how bloodthirsty the rebellion could be in carrying out the execution possibly of an abbot. Sedbar also agreed that Aske's army could take control of the abbey's horses. Robert Aske and the rebels entered York on the 16th of October. It is estimated that Aske had now built up an army that numbered around 20,000 men. He made a speech that stated, "We have taken this pilgrimage for the preservation of Christ's Church, of this realm of England. The King, our sovereign Lord, the nobility and commons of the same, the monasteries in the north, gave great to the poor men, and laudably served God. By occasion of this said suppression of the monasteries, the divine service of Almighty God is much diminished." His army after entering York were greatly successful, and they ordered nuns and monks back into their houses, with Henry VIII's lieutenants ordered out by force. Aske now marched towards Pontefract Castle and besieged the castle. This was then surrendered on the 20th of October by Thomas Darcy, who had sent a message to the king, saying he did not have enough soldiers to defend the castle. Henry wrote back, saying he was surprised he could not do nothing more effective to defeat the rebels, but pledged his loyalty to Darcy. However, Henry himself would have had his doubts about Darcy being a traitor, but most probably thought that if he had not surrendered, then he would have been killed by the rebelling commoners if they stormed the castle. By the end of October, the uprising had spread quickly across the north to Lancashire, Durham, Northumberland and Cumberland. The rebels arrived at Sawley Abbey, which had recently closed down, and the army invited the monks to return. When King Henry heard the news, he instructed Henry Stanley, the 4th Earl of Derby, to seize possession of the abbey and hang the abbot and the monks without trial. They were to be hanged in their monks' habits, but Derby explained to Henry how he did not have enough troops to be able to carry out these orders and face the opposition, which was now swelling to dozens of thousands of men. It's clear that Robert Aske was a great leader and a motivator to get people to join the cause. King Henry was at crisis point. He was in danger of the North's influence spreading, and Robert Aske was becoming incredibly powerful. He summoned Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, out of retirement at the age of 63 to sort out the mess. He was selected as he did oppose Thomas Cromwell and was a leading Roman Catholic, so it was believed the rebels would trust him. Norfolk met with Thomas Darcy and tried to persuade him and other Yorkshire nobles to regain the king's favour by handing over that villain Robert Aske. They refused, and Norfolk returned to Henry, suggesting the best way of dealing with the mess was to pardon the northern rebels, and then when the army had dispersed, the leaders could be punished. Henry took this on board and agreed a pardon of everyone north of Doncaster who had taken part in the rebellion, and he personally invited Robert Aske to London to discuss the grievances of the people of Yorkshire. Robert Aske spent the Christmas holiday with Henry VIII at Greenwich Palace. When they first met, Henry said, "Be you welcome, my good sake. It is my wish here before my council. You ask what you desire, and I will grant it." Aske replied, "Sir, your majesty allows yourself to be governed by a tyrant named Cromwell. Everyone knows that if it had not been for him, the 7,000 poor priests I have in my company would not be ruined wanderers as they are for now." Henry seemed to agree with Aske about Cromwell's power, and to show his support of the rebel leader, he gave him a jacket of crimson silk. However, when in London, another rebellion broke out in the East Riding. This was led by Sir Francis Bigod, who accused Aske of betraying the Pilgrimage of Grace by meeting with the king, and Aske agreed to return to Yorkshire and gathered his men to defeat Bigod, joining up with Thomas Howard and his army. They easily defeated Bigod, and on the 24th of March 1537, Robert was asked by the Duke of Norfolk to return to London to meet with the king again, with him being told the king wanted to thank him for putting down Bigod's rebellion. This though would quickly change, as on his arrival to the capital, Robert Aske was arrested and thrown into the Tower of London. Cromwell had kept a low profile during the Pilgrimage of Grace, as he was a very hated figure. However, he conducted the examination and interrogation of Robert Aske. Robert was asked a total of 107 questions, and he made no attempt to deny his early involvement in the Pilgrimage of Grace. He told a very straightforward testimony, and he was deemed to be incapable of telling a lie. Cromwell managed to obtain statements from some of the prisoners that implicated Aske, and he also found a letter signed by Robert that called on people not to join Bigod and to remain in their homes. Cromwell stated that by telling people to do this, he was instructing people not to join the king's army, in not assisting the suppression of Bigod's rebellion, and according to Cromwell, this was treason, of which Robert Aske was found guilty of. It's most likely that Robert Aske was hung in chains. Some believe that he could have been hanged, drawn and quartered though. In a letter from the Duke of Norfolk to Cromwell, he wrote that all the traitors in this shire were hung in chains. This was a form of punishment and deterrence that was used for centuries in England and is known as gibbeting. This was where criminals and rebels were displayed in public on display and slowly hanged with their bodies remaining for everyone to see in an act of putting the general public off rebelling. It was also a way of letting the relatives of the rebels suffer in terrifying fashion, seeing their loved ones slowly rotting away in full sight. Following his trial, Aske was taken back to York to be hanged in his heartland and in the heart of the rebellion county that he had been so active in. He was paraded through the towns in the county, being publicly shamed as a traitor. On the 12th of July 1537, he arrived back in York for his execution. His execution was ordered for a market day, in which the city of York would have been extremely busy, and his public execution would have attracted a huge crowd near to Clifford's Tower. Clifford's Tower today is part of the original York Castle that stood at the time, and it was here where a gallows had been built. So Aske had been dragged through the crowded streets of York on market day and was then taken to the top of Clifford's Tower. From this, he was then wrapped further in chains, taken to the top of Clifford's Tower above the baying crowd, and then thrown off and hanged. The graphic description of Aske's death has been stated as occurring in brutal fashion. The most detailed account actually comes from a historical novel, The Man on a Donkey, set in 1530s Yorkshire. It states of Aske's death, when he swung out and the irons bit him, he did struggle, because he must. One of his shoes came off, and it seemed to be a frightful thing that he should have to go short of a shoe, until he remembered he would not ever again tread upon anything but the empty air. He was alone now. Beside him the Roundley was empty, but when he glanced down into the sickening depth below his feet, he could see that the green space was full of white faces turned up to him. With a growing of iron upon iron, he was turning slowly round. The minster came into sight just as the bells sounded, tossing out their bubbles of sweet sound upon the air. Still he turned. Now he saw Fishergate Bar, half ruinous since it had been blocked up for so long. Now the wide country beyond, patched golden with harvest. The hours wore on, and the pain grew. Towards the evening, he began to suffer from thirst. Thunder came after dark, and with it rain, a great sluice of unseen waters that mashed down great swathes of the tall, heavy-headed wheat. Rain beating on his head and neck brought Aske back for a little while, out of the nightmare into conscious horror. He saw in the scribble of lightning, which split black night, the sheer drop of the wall beside him, the green far away below. And as his eyes told him of the sickening depth below his body, and as his mind foreknew the lagging endlessness of torment before him, so as if the lightning had brought an inner illumination also, he knew the greater gulf of despair above which his spirit hung, helpless and aghast. Then Aske met the full assault of darkness without reprieve, of hope for light, for God, ultimately vanquished, was no God at all. So Robert Aske started life as a lawyer who was of relatively noble birth. However, his involvement in the Pilgrimage of Grace brought him a great deal of power and notoriety, especially across the north of England. His death, in which he was brutally hanged in chains above Clifford's Tower, signifies Henry VIII's need to put down and suppress the rebellion, and also ensure his population live within his rules. The sheer deterrent of the high-profile Aske being hanged in chains from the castle shows Henry's true intentions to scare the people of York and the north. Aske met a horrific end, with being hanged in chains being brutally painful, with the chains digging into his skin, causing horrendous pain. His story remains an incredibly powerful and interesting one, with his death showing the king's brutality, and how Tudor monarchs dealt with traitors and dangers internally to their powers. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.